A single papyrus fragment lies on a stone slab beneath a vaulted ceiling in the dim light of an underground storage chamber. It is cracked along one edge, the ink faded, but still legible. Words in Greek script, the letters blurred as if written by hand that trembled. The fragment bears no title, only a passage from what may be a lost treatise on astronomy, its margins scrawled with notes in a different hand, perhaps later corrections or marginalia added centuries after it was first copied. Around it, other fragments, some inscribed with the names of gods, others bearing mathematical calculations, are stacked like bones beneath the stone floor of a forgotten archive. This is not the great library, as myth remembers it. The golden hall filled with scrolls from every corner of the known world, where scholars gathered under domed ceilings to debate philosophy and map the stars. This is something quieter, more intimate, an inheritance stripped down to its fragments, buried beneath centuries of empire, conquest, fire, and forgetting. The story of Alexandria's libraries begins not in a single moment, but across generations, a confluence of ambition, war, politics, and accident. There was no one library at the beginning. There were institutions layered like strata, a royal collection built by Alexander's successor, a scholarly gathering place developed into something more than a storeroom, later transformed by political shifts into an intellectual battleground, where power and knowledge became entangled in ways that would doom its survival. What we know with certainty is this: Alexandria had libraries. What remains contested, whether they were ever truly unified under one roof, whether their destruction was swift or gradual, whether the fires of history came from war or neglect. The legend grows louder than the evidence. It speaks not only of loss, but of what we wish to believe about learning and memory, the idea that a single fire could erase an entire world's mind. But here, beneath dust and time, is proof. Someone once cared enough to write this down. Alexandria, built by Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE at the intersection of three great worlds, Mediterranean, African, and Near Eastern, rose from a modest coastal settlement into a city that would shape the intellectual future of civilization. Situated on Egypt's northern coast, along the Nile Delta, it was not merely a port, but a crossroads where Greek thought met Egyptian tradition, Phoenician commerce, and Persian administrative systems. This convergence created an environment uniquely suited to ambition, political, scholarly, and cultural. The city emerged as the capital of Ptolemaic Egypt after Alexander's death, when his general Ptolemy, assisting Sota, established a dynasty that ruled for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were not just kings, they were patrons of learning, driven by a vision of Alexandria as the center of knowledge and reason in the ancient world. They invited philosophers, astronomers, mathematicians, poets, and physicians from across the Mediterranean to gather within its walls. At the heart of this ambition stood the Mouseion, a term meaning shrine of the muses, a vast research institution that functioned as both a university and an academy. Here scholars worked in collaboration, translating texts into Greek, studying medicine under the moonlight, observing stars from observatories, and compiling encyclopedic knowledge. The library that grew around it was not one single building, but likely a network of collections housed across several buildings near the royal palace and temple complexes along the Carnapic Way. But this was not an age of peace. Rivalries between Greek city-states, Roman expansion into the eastern Mediterranean, internal struggles within Egypt's ruling class. These currents shaped Alexandria as much as scholarly pursuit did. The library's story is not one of a single great fire or sudden end, but of multiple phases, shifting power structures and gradual erosion over centuries. Its legacy was born not in destruction, but in aspiration, and its loss, when it came, was neither swift nor singular, but layered through time, war, politics, and forgetting. What remains of Alexandria's great libraries today is fragmentary, not in scrolls, but in echoes. The physical ruins of a single library are still unknown beneath the modern city, though excavations near the ancient harbour have uncovered fragments of stone tablets inscribed with Greek and Latin script, remnants perhaps from administrative offices or small reading spaces rather than grand collections. No intact papyri survived from the fire that consumed the Serapeum in the late 3rd century, nor from the later conflagration attributed to Julius Caesar's campaign. The most direct evidence comes not from ruins, but from surviving texts, manuscripts copied by scribes centuries after the events, often quoting or referencing works lost elsewhere. These include citations in medical treatises, philosophical dialogues, and astronomical calculations, proof that knowledge once flourished there. Scholarly reconstruction relies heavily on the writings of later authors like Strabo, Pliny the Elder, and Galen, whose accounts are themselves layered with interpretation and sometimes contradiction. Some describe a single library within the Serapeum. Others suggest multiple collections dispersed across Alexandria's intellectual centres. The reliability of these sources varies. Their descriptions reflect personal experience or second-hand reports, often shaped by political or cultural agendas. Archaeological surveys using ground-penetrating radar have identified possible foundations beneath the current coastline and city centre, but no definitive library structure has been confirmed. Scientific analysis of papyrus fragments, some found in tombs or desert caches, has revealed Greek, Egyptian, and even Aramaic texts, suggesting a multilingual, scholarly culture. Radiocarbon dating helps place these materials in context, while ink composition studies reveal the tools used by ancient scribes. Yet no single piece of evidence confirms what happened to the books. The truth lies not in one artifact, but in the convergence of surviving words, fragmentary remains, and careful skepticism, revealing that Alexandria's loss was neither a single event nor an instant fire, but a slow erosion over centuries, shaped by war, politics, shifting priorities, and time itself. In the narrow streets of Alexandria, where sun-baked stone met salt-laden air, life moved in rhythms shaped by empire and tide. A fisherman's daughter woke before dawn to mend nets under oil lamps, her fingers tracing knots learned from her mother, who had learned them from hers. Each loop a quiet act of survival. By morning light she would carry baskets down to the docks, trading silken catches for barley bread and olive oil at the market stalls near the Serapeum gate. The scent of roasting fish mingled with dust and incense drifting from temple courtyards. A scribe's apprentice brushed ink onto papyrus in a room lined with scrolls stacked like firewood, his hands stained blue from the dye, his eyes straining after hours beneath lamplight. He was paid not in coin, but in barley rations and a small loaf each week. His work, copying lists of grain yields, records of tax assessments, letters from governors to officials in Ptolemaic courts. These were not grand epics or philosophical treatises. These were the daily breaths of empire. In homes near the harbour, women mixed clay for ovens, while children played with fragments of broken pottery, bits of amphorae that once carried wine from Lesbos. Some families lived in stone houses with flat roofs and courtyards where fig trees grew through cracks in the tiles. Others dwelled in crowded tenements, their rooms stacked above shops or workshops, air thick with cooking smoke and the constant hum of voices. The city was alive not only with scholars debating on marble benches, but also with fear of fire spreading fast through wooden rooftops during dry winds, of ships stranding at nightfall when lighthouse beams failed, of soldiers marching under unfamiliar banners. The loss of a single scroll meant little to most, but for one family who had traded 3 days' labour for the paper and ink that carried their son's name in a tax register, it was the quiet end of something irreplaceable. This was Alexandria, not as myth, but as lived breath, ordinary hands shaping survival from stone, water, and time. The central dynamic of Alexandria's libraries is not one of simple destruction, but of a slow unravelling, of institutions caught between ambition and collapse, shaped by forces beyond any single library's control. The dream was grand, to collect all human knowledge under one roof, in a city built on the idea that wisdom could be gathered like grain. But this was never just about books, it was about power. The kind of power that comes from controlling what is known and how it is remembered. The great Library of Alexandria, as it came to be called, did not arise overnight. It grew through decades of royal initiative, scholarly negotiation, and political manoeuvring. Ptolemy Boris's vision evolved into something far more complex. First a temple to knowledge in the Serapeum, then a sprawling academic centre where scholars from across the Mediterranean gathered, debated, translated texts from Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian and Hebrew sources. The library was less a single building than an ecosystem. Reading rooms, lecture halls, gardens for study, even dormitories for foreign researchers. It thrived not because of its walls, but because it functioned as a kind of intellectual network connected to other centres in the Hellenistic world, sustained by royal patronage and scholarly loyalty. Yet this very interconnectedness became its vulnerability. The libraries were never monolithic. There was no single archive with universal authority. There were multiple sites, one near the palace complex, another possibly at the Serapeum, perhaps others scattered through the city's intellectual quarters. When fire came, whether in 48 BCE during Julius Caesar's campaign or later under Roman rule, it did not consume a unified institution but damaged parts of an evolving system that had never been fully consolidated. The loss was real and profound. Thousands of texts vanished, some irreplaceable, others lost to time. The deeper truth is this: the libraries were not destroyed once, but over centuries, through war, neglect, shifting politics, and a slow erosion of scholarly infrastructure. The myth of one great library burning in flames obscures a more complicated reality: the steady decline of an intellectual culture that had already begun to fragment long before any fire touched its shelves. The true turning came not with a single fire, but in the slow erosion of stability that followed centuries of scholarly flourishing. By the time Rome's dominance solidified over Egypt, Alexandria remained a beacon, its scholars still translating texts across languages, its halls humming with debate on astronomy and medicine. Yet imperial power was never neutral. It shifted allegiances as emperors changed, and knowledge became less a shared pursuit than a tool wielded in shifting political currents. The first great fracture came not from fire, but from decree. Roman authority began to tighten control over the city's intellectual life. limiting access to certain texts deemed politically or religiously sensitive. The library's role evolved, not as an open archive of all human thought, but as a repository under scrutiny, its contents measured not by curiosity alone, but by how they might serve imperial interests. Then came the gradual collapse of institutional continuity. As Rome's grip on the eastern provinces weakened, Alexandria found itself caught between competing powers, the fading Roman administration and rising forces from within Egypt and beyond. The city's scholarly networks frayed under pressure, scholars fled or were silenced, manuscripts were moved, lost, or copied in secrecy. The fires that would later be mythologized did not come all at once. There were several incidents, each documented with varying degrees of clarity, none clearly linked to a single act of destruction. One early fire may have damaged parts of the Serapeum, though its exact location and scale remain contested. Subsequent conflicts during periods of civil unrest saw libraries likely scattered or repurposed. What remained was not obliterated in one moment, but dismantled over time through neglect, migration, and changing priorities. There is no single day when Alexandria's great library ended. What occurred instead was a slow unravelling of governance, of scholarly consensus, of the very idea that knowledge could be preserved collectively under one roof. The turning wasn't an event, it was a process, obscured by centuries of retelling, where memory blurred into myth and loss became legend rather than record. What remains uncertain is vast and often obscured by centuries of myth-making. The image of a single, grand library burned in one catastrophic flame is a narrative convenience, not history. There was no singular Library of Alexandria. Instead, there were multiple institutions scattered across the city's intellectual quarters, the Serapeum, the Mausion, perhaps others lost to time or reorganization. We do not know how many volumes were housed. No inventory survives, and we cannot say with certainty whether they were collected in a single building or dispersed among research centres and royal archives. The idea that Alexander himself commissioned an empire-wide book collection is compelling but unverified. It may reflect later admiration rather than fact. The fate of the library is one of history's great uncertainties. While fires are known to have ravaged Alexandria, most notably during Julius Caesar's siege in 48 BCE, the evidence for their impact on any library remains indirect and contested. Some ancient sources speak of destruction, but they do not name the library specifically, nor do they describe a complete loss. The notion that Alexander's original plan was abandoned due to political shifts or imperial overreach is plausible, yet unproven. Later accounts blaming Christian emperors for the burning of scholarly works are deeply rooted in theological conflict and selective memory. There is no direct evidence linking any major fire in Alexandria to systematic destruction of texts by Christians. The myth that the library was lost forever, its knowledge erased, is powerful but misleading. Surviving fragments, later copied through Byzantine and Islamic scholars, suggest some works that endured far longer than we once believed. What was truly lost may have been less about physical books and more about context, the intellectual networks, the collaborative ethos of Alexandria's scholarly community, the open exchange of thought that defined its golden era. We are left not with a single act of ruin, but with layers of erasure, fragmented by war, mislaid in transition, forgotten through neglect. The real tragedy is not one fire, but the slow unravelling of a culture where curiosity was valued above empire. The Library of Alexandria endures not because it was perfect, but because it stood in defiance of forgetting. What survives is less a building than an idea, the dream that knowledge could be gathered, preserved, and made common ground across empires and tongues. It was never one library, nor did it ever remain whole. Yet the myth grew around its ruins like ivy over stone, a beacon of reason, a sanctuary where scholars from Athens to Babylon debated under one roof, where scrolls were copied by hand in silence that stretched for generations. The fires, whether accidental or deliberate, are less important than what they symbolized. Each blaze marked not just destruction, but the fragility of human endeavor. The library did not vanish overnight. It was worn down over centuries. Its purpose eroded as power shifted and priorities changed. Some say it burned in Caesar's war, others that it fell to ignorance or indifference. But more than any single fire, what broke Alexandria's scholarly spirit was time that outlived empires, time that allowed the idea of shared knowledge to be questioned, then abandoned. And still, we return to this story, not because we can reconstruct its halls, but because the longing it stirs is ours too, the fear that wisdom might one day be lost again, that books could vanish in silence, that reason might be quieted by chaos or neglect. In seeking the library's truth, we are not chasing a past, but confronting our own moment, an age of information overload and attention scarcity, where access to knowledge is vast yet unevenly distributed, that such a dream persists. This image of a place built on curiosity, open to all who would listen, is itself a quiet act of resistance. The library was never just bricks and scrolls. It was a promise written in ink, that understanding is worth preserving even when no one is watching. And so we remember not for what was lost, but for the courage it took to imagine it ever could be found.